Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the webinar with Devon Fernandes. So my name is Jen. I'm an 18-year-old university student with a passion for sustainability, and I'm based in New York, and I'll be hosting today. So a little background on us before we start. SustainED is a nonprofit organization with a vision to empower the next generation of sustainability leaders to take action and scale impact with support by a community of mentors. To solve the tough problems we are facing now, we know the world needs exponentially more change makers. We need leaders like yourself to step up and lead initiatives, and we need you to learn faster from the current practitioners to be even more effective. That's why we are hosting a webinar series as part of our initiatives to build a community of change makers. Joining us today is Devon Fernandes. He's a sustainability specialist at Humber College and co-founder of KW Library of Things. He works to catalyze sustainable initiatives within a variety of organizations and was named one of Canada's top 25 under 25 environmentalists according to the Starfish Foundation and one of Canada's top 30 under 30 sustainability leaders according to the Corporate Knights. Without further ado, welcome Devon. So, could you tell us in 20 seconds, no jargon, what you do for work?
Sure. So as Humber Sustainability Specialist, I coordinate and manage programs related to waste reduction and management, transportation, and how those intersect with equity and diversity. So in sustainability, there's tons of jargon, and I can go into a lot more detail, but essentially it means any environmental programs, I'm one of the people who manages those.
Awesome. So why is it important for you to do what you do?
I think it's important from a moral stance in terms of I see an issue in the world that I think I can contribute to solving. And then I also think there's just tons of demand for sustainability work around the world. And so I think it's not only something that I should do, but that everyone should be a part of.
Okay, so I think we're going to start your presentation and you can tell us a little bit more about what you're working on now.
So yeah, my name is Devon Fernandes. I have a few different roles that I always work with. I'm someone who doesn't like to stay put all the time and who constantly likes to work on different things. So here are some of my roles. I work at Humber College, as was mentioned, and I also do some work in Kitchener-Waterloo. So a lot of what I want to focus on today was just around how we perceive our ability to change our surroundings. And I often get this question around, you're just one person, or what difference can one person make? And I wanted to kind of explore that a bit with all of you. So I want to pose your question. If you can put in the chat, if there are any documentaries you've watched about sustainability, what are they? And what are your favorite ones? There's tons of different documentaries out there. And I remember one night I was watching, I believe it was Plastic Ocean, or it was another documentary about plastics. And I was pretty intrigued by it. And my partner walked in the door. She just come home from work. And she was telling me, like, Devon, why are you watching this documentary? You already know this stuff. The only thing that you're doing is making yourself a bit more depressed. So how can we find this line between like action versus getting a bit more knowledge around these different topics? And so I think my partner was really right in terms of helping me understand where I need to be. But as I think a lot of people are trying to learn more about diversity, equity, inclusion, or about climate change, when you look into it, it kind of gets a bit more depressing, and you consider what can my impact be, or how can I actually have a positive impact if I don't know or don't have all the tools to do so. So I started going down this kind of journey to figure out what I could specifically do. So I ended up doing a master's in community psychology at Wilfrid Laurier University. And it's specifically about how can we address systems thinking and look at problems as a systems problem. So for me, that looked at sustainability as something that we all contribute to as individuals, businesses contribute to, our communities do, or the governments do, and realizing that we're all part of the problem. And how can we address that? And so I focused on the people side of sustainability, and it's something that's not often talked about. We often think we need these technological fixes to solve climate change, but in reality, the people are the problem, and we need to kind of change the way we think, and we need to address that. as quickly as possible. And so that's what the majority of my master's focused on. And through my master's, I ended up co-founding an organization called the KW Library of Things. And so it's in Kitchener-Waterloo in Ontario, and it's a space where community members can borrow infrequently used items like tools, camp equipment, or kitchen items. So you'll see on the picture on the left, there's tons of different items in the background. And essentially, it's like an expanded public library. People come in and borrow the items for 1 week at a time. And it reduces the environmental impact of having to buy those items new. So the landfill where Kitchener-Waterloo is located, that all of their kind of garbage goes to, is going to reach capacity in 2030. And so the region is trying to think of, where is our next landfill, or how are we going to deal with this? But if we can think of innovative solutions that create a circular or sharing economy that address these, it solves many of those problems related to the environment. But I work with 2 local organizations, one of which was Extended Family Waterloo Region, who I now sit on their board of directors. And they focus on working with people with disabilities in the region. And what they were, when we started working on this project together, we decided to make sure that the library would provide living wages for individuals who face barriers to employment, like individuals with disabilities. Because for the most part, there are often volunteer opportunities for individuals with disabilities that will hopefully someday lead to paid employment, but that usually isn't the case. And so we've employed several individuals with disabilities or varying disabilities to work, learn, demonstrate their skills in our library, interact with our customers. And it's part of a mentorship model that has been developed there. And that really ties in how we can add a people element to this. So I don't think environmental problems will be solved if we're just trying to address them by ourselves. I think it's really upon us to consider how we're going to integrate a people side to it. And it's something that became really important when I started to consider how I was actually going to build this library. So it was a huge community effort. It's by no means just my work that was involved in this. And one of the things that helped start this library was I went to a community fair, essentially, where when I was first starting the library, I asked people, what is most important to be included in a library? What would you like to see? And the first community member that I asked actually gave me $20 and said, I've heard enough, make it a reality. And that was such an empowering thing for me and really spoke to, if we want to have change on the environment, we need people on board. And then on the right side over here on the slide, you can see that there's kind of an infographic on how to join the library. And that's something that was, again, developed with the community on board, who was saying, we want to make sure that people know what the library has to offer and how to interact with the library of things. So I have a quick question for all of you. How many minutes or hours do you think the average drill is used in its lifetime before being discarded? So if you can put it in the chat, that would be great. And I'm seeing in the chat here, which is great, that 50 hours, 100 hours, 50 hours sounds right. The sad reality is that the numbers differ depending where you are, but the average power drill is used for about 11 minutes in its lifetime before being discarded. So if you think about those items that you have in your life that you use very infrequently, when I told my parents the stat, they were like, there's no way. And I would question them and was like, well, when's the last time you used your drill? And they're like, well, it's just sitting downstairs whenever we have something that needs to be fixed. It's maybe used for about 30 seconds to fix that certain thing. But how can we question these items that we use on a regular basis and really question whether we need them as permanent fixtures or as fixtures in our community? And so I think there's a real importance to understand how these items are used and whether we have to be part of this society that constantly pressures us to consume all the time. My partner and I have been together for a few years now, and we've basically refused to give each other physical gifts for birthdays and things like that. We always do experiences, and as you can imagine, I'm very much not trying to accumulate different things in my life. I just want kind of experiences rather than gifts. Paul mentioned just in the chat now that they don't want to drill just holes in the wall. And that's such a great motto in terms of you don't actually need the drill, you just need the actual result. And so how can you get there?
So just a question, how did you get your idea or project like that off the ground? How did you just get the confidence to do it and go for it?
There's several libraries around the world, libraries of things around the world. There's over 100 now. I'm not the first one to think of this idea by any means. And when I was starting to work on this library, I actually did kind of like a road show to look at other libraries in Ontario. There's one in Toronto. And they served as a real source of inspiration for me. Ours is the only one that attaches that livable wages for individuals with disabilities piece onto it. And then our library also provides a sliding scale for membership fees. So it's around $50 a year for to be a member, but usually in most cases you're saving the first time you borrow an item. And we understand that $50 can be inaccessible. So we have, I think we have over about $1,000 worth of memberships that are donated by local community members. So if $50 isn't accessible, you can actually come into our library and say, you know what, I'm a member of this community. How could I get a membership? And they just said, you know what, if you commit to being a member of our community, we'll give you this membership for free or at a subsidized cost. And that all came through conversations with people around the world who had developed similar things. Like my entire, a lot of the work that I do isn't like, it's not reinventing the wheel, it's all sharing ideas. And I didn't really have the confidence to start something like this because I didn't realize what I was starting while I was doing it. So it was all through just understanding what people were doing. So I really wanted to be part of a community, and that was what the Library of Things really helped me develop. I had this role at the Kitchener-Waterloo Library of Things, and then I graduated from my master's, and I was trying to figure out what is the next step for me. All my family is in Toronto, so I thought I was going to move back to Toronto. And I ended up getting a role as Humber College's sustainability specialist, where I work on a variety of projects related to sustainability. And they all have a common thread around trying to change culture. And so Humber College recently came out with their 5-year strategic plan around sustainability. And so here's the graphic on my right. And if you think about all the aspects that are related to the environment or sustainability in an organization or a college, you're talking about, you know, how are you managing your waste, your water, your energy, your green spaces? How are you getting students to think more about sustainability in their courses? But the common layer that we thought about in this plan is how can we change culture? Because if we have a thriving environment, but we don't have people that embrace a culture of equity, diversity, and inclusion, like what's ultimately the point? And so the common thread is that we can all be part of solutions if we think about them in a collaborative way. And I think this is part of what I think the sustainability field needs to move towards in terms of not just focusing on environmental solutions, but on people solutions. How can we change perspectives, have a growth mindset, and encourage people to adopt the same? And it's pretty funny because I often challenge people to like consider things from a sustainable aspect, but it's not just the environment. I'm also challenging them on equity, diversity, and inclusion that they often might not expect from my role at an institution. And so I was thinking about this webinar in terms of a couple points in terms of how to change behavior. My background is in psychology, which is quite rare for someone in a sustainability field. And I just want to share some principles around that. So what I've learned through experience and through evidence-based research is to try and be a role model. So at one of my previous jobs a few years ago, I used to bike 20 kilometers each way to work. And when I would get to work, I would put my bike helmet at the top of my workstation. So as people would come in, they would see a bike helmet. And soon people started to talk to me about biking. How long would it take to work? How do you deal with like using the shower at work? Like how do you bike to work? And so soon more and more people are asking me these questions. And eventually a few of my coworkers started biking themselves because they saw it was attainable. They saw it was something easy to do. They saw it was recognizable. And then there were people kind of gathering around it. And so making these things that can be hidden at times more visible and role modeling that behavior can be really helpful. And I started like a mini composting program during my master's where I just started a compost bin in our faculty area where there wasn't one before. And at first I was just using it and disposing of it. And then soon everyone in the department was. And then soon it was being taken up by facilities. And so I think making things more visible is definitely something from a psychological perspective in terms of being really helpful. The other one is recognizing the sphere of influence. So during my master's, I was both a student, a teaching assistant, working as a consultant, a citizen of, or I guess someone living in Kitchener-Waterloo. Those are all different ways that you can exercise influence. So emailing your city councilor or emailing your prof, your dean, any way that you can get involved. I think people often are like, well, I have no power. I'm just one person. And I think we have to make sure that we hold others to account as well as ourselves in terms of this. So I'm the first one to email every business that I ever interact with around, here are some suggestions in a constructive way that I think would be helpful for you. And I think when they hear it from someone who isn't a sustainability person, it almost makes more of an impact. So when I email laws around how to reduce plastic packaging, I'm emailing them as a consumer. I don't put sustainability specialist at the bottom of my email. It's just Devon lives around the corner type thing. Be curious rather than trying to convince. So when I worked as a sustainability teaching assistant at Wilfrid Laurier University, I had a student who took one of our tutorials, and in the first couple of classes, he shared with me that he was a Trump supporter and didn't believe in climate change. And he shared with us the entire class, and I didn't really know what to do. And so what I ended up figuring out during this class is I asked the student, so this is very interesting, like, why did you decide to enroll in this class? And he said, I'm just interested in this. I don't get the sustainability stuff. I'm just interested. And so I said, well, that is the best thing. I'm so excited you're in this class because you're open and willing to learn. And I would like to learn just as much from you. So we both decided to assign each other a book to read. So I said, I'll assign you something from my set of values and my perspective, and you assign me something from your set of values and your perspective, and let's swap. And by the end of the term, let's hope we read the book and let's talk about it. And he actually ended up reading the book and going through the class, and he changed his degree at the end of the class, which was really cool to involve a more sustainability focus. So I'm not to say that happens all the time, but I think trying to be curious rather than convince people at the beginning is a really, really big asset. Next one, you don't need to be a sustainability expert. I have never taken a sustainability class in my life, which often surprises people. I just read and am curious, and I look up as much as I can, and I ask a lot of questions. There's a lot of people who are in sustainability roles, and they just want to share as much knowledge as possible. That's part of why I'm doing this webinar. Like I think everyone in a sustainability role is like, if you have a question, I will help you. I will give you as many resources because I want to make sure that you can have your impact as well. And the last thing was about like a motto that I heard a couple of years ago that's really stuck with me. It's find your passion, find your people, and get to work. I don't think there's so many barriers in terms of starting an initiative, in terms of getting involved. But I think if you have something that you're interested in, you have people around you, either in your personal life, family, friends, coworkers, who can support you, and then you're able to do something constructive with that, I think nothing's stopping you. So those are just some tips I had around the person side perspective of it, but I think it's really upon us to challenge these institutions, especially businesses and governments, to act, because individual action at the end of the day is important to convince these larger institutions who have the ability to change things. And making sure that we're doing that in an equitable way. I think we've always relied and sometimes I acknowledge that people of color, Black and Indigenous people in Canada have often led that fight, but trying to make sure that we're taking it upon all ourselves to push that forward is really important.
So a lot of people in our audiences are students. So I think you mentioned a little bit about your interaction at university and all the different roles you had, but can you mention any maybe more specific opportunities that you found while being in school that kind of helped you along your journey?
Sure. A couple of things that helped me. I think one of the smartest things I ever did unintentionally was during my undergrad, I was at the University of Guelph studying psychology, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And what I ended up doing was sitting in on lectures that I wasn't registered in. So as I know most students are like, why would I ever go to more classes? That sounds like the last thing I want to do. But I just went with my friends to their lectures. And the University of Guelph is known for their agricultural college. So I went to classes on like cows or toxicology. And I went on quite a few different classes that I wasn't registered in. If I liked the class, I stayed and talked to the TA or the prof. If I didn't, I decided to just exit the class quietly. And it's something that like most students can take advantage of. In COVID, it's a bit different. But it really allowed me to have a like large appreciation for different fields. And then that's how I stumbled upon organizational behavior. And so after I graduated school, my undergrad, I ended up working in an organizational behavior role. So how can we change organizational culture and that type of thing, which then pushed me into sustainability. So I think just trying to, school is the best place in terms of getting exposure to different things. But I think not being just focused on only the classes that you're enrolled in. I think like your teachers have a vast array of expertise in different things. So just talk to them. I think it's one of the most useful things. And one thing relating to your comment around like speaking to the choir is I never introduce myself when I meet people. Like if let's say I'm at a party and people are sharing what their roles are, I never talk about climate change unless people ask. Because as soon as you talk about climate change, people kind of rule you out. They're like, okay, I know what this guy's going to say. But usually if people ask me a question like, hey, what do you do? Then I'll tell them, and I'll kind of keep it very simple, but I'll encourage them to ask the questions. Because if I'm always trying to go in, if I'm always trying to say these things, people just tune out and they rule you out as you know, like you're that tree hugger who's just going to say all these things. But I think when you allow them to be part of a conversation, it becomes a lot more fruitful.
Well, I think we mentioned like kind of throughout this documentaries and books that you were reading. So I think from a question from Christine Russell, is can you recommend a few books or documentaries that you found worthwhile?
That's a great question. I can actually share with you, I'll put it in the chat. Me and one of the librarians at Humber, we created a library guide for sustainable education and research. So it has all the different, I just put a link there. It has all the different books, resources, and tools for students and faculty. So I'd encourage you to explore that. Around specific things that I use, I tend to use like news clips or interviews, I think are very useful. There's an interview by Diane Sachs. She was on one of the previous webinars that I always go back to, and it's her talking to Steve Paikin. I'll try to find the clip while we're chatting. And it's her talking to Steve Paikin around environmental racism in Amjanong and Sarnia. And I use that clip all the time because it's so blatant how absurd it is what's happening. And I think in every class that I've TA'd, I always show it. It's always been really, really helpful. And then always trying to find diverse perspectives. So there is a consulting group, they're called our Future Ancestors. And so they have a variety of sources on their website as well that are all from diverse sources that I encourage you to explore.
I think you kind of touched upon the idea when you said going to different lectures that are maybe not specifically in your area of interest or specifically part of your like major or job choice. And I feel like that kind of touches upon the idea of the interconnectedness of sustainability and how it needs to be implemented into kind of each and every field and each and every like area of work, and how it's kind of just the circular economy idea. And I think that there's something for everyone. And it's the idea of, I think you also mentioned it, like questioning something in your everyday life and seeing how can this become more sustainable. Because I've done that, especially I'm trying to become like less and less waste, like becoming more zero waste in my own lifestyle. And I've decided that a lot of the snacks that I eat, instead of buying these single-use packages, I can always make better versions at home by buying in bulk. And that's not always an opportunity for everybody, but it's just looking at one area of your life and then reducing it down to zero, or as close to zero as you can, and then looking at another area of your life. And it doesn't have to be this big, crazy idea. It could just be like little by little. And I love the idea that you said, you haven't taken a single sustainability course, because it makes it so attainable for people. Instead of saying like, oh, I have to be in this one category, it's everyone can be a part of this movement.
And I think everyone needs to feel that they're part of the movement in some way. Like I have two older brothers. One of them is like a climate change consultant and the other is a social worker. And I always joke with people that the social worker has the largest impact on climate change, because when he's asking for things, he's not seen as the tree hugger. He's not seen as a sustainability person. And I think it's so imperative that we all see ourselves in it somehow, regardless of how you can influence your surrounding spheres of influence. Like, we're all a part of it. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that, and how are we actually going to go about it. There's tons of like at Humber, for example, some of the people who I thought would be the largest challenges for us to kind of convince in some ways were our largest supporters. And then some challenges that I've run into at Humber around some people being stuck in a different mindset. I think conveying empathy and conveying a sense of, I'm trying to understand what you're going through. I may not completely understand your shoes or your job, but help me out. And so there was someone that I was trying to influence. They had influence over one of the contracts that Humber manages that I think could be done in a more sustainable fashion. And so I was talking to them, and we were kind of butting heads. And I ended up figuring out their role is similar to my role in that it relates to so many things across the college. So, as soon as someone enters the building or does anything, you have to think about this. So I conveyed to them, I was like, I don't know what your role is, but I understand how, if anything happens at the college, you think about it, and you think about it in this way, and that's just the same as me, and that's why I want this contract to incorporate this. And then they were so much more willing once I understood just a sliver of what they were talking about. And I think it's important for all of us to just try and consider what someone is going through, or just try and figure out how we can get more people part of this movement.
That's a great point. And you mentioned empathy, and I saw this quote the other day, especially with everything that's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality. There was a quote, I have it here, it's empathy and compassion for others can be tools that help us create change. And it's just like being kind of like knowing and like talking is just as important as being an active listener. And I really love how you're pushing these points of that it's not just about the technology, but it's about the people-to-people approach, and how we all need to kind of come together as a community rather than just only focus on the technology. And of course the innovations are great, but it's also about community and what we can do together. But if there's any one fact or statistic that you've learned in the past few years that maybe you want all of us to take away from today, what would it be?
My whole thing is about mindsets. I'm not, even though I work on a lot of technical stuff, my background isn't in technical things. So I think the one thing that I'd impress on people is, especially now, to consider environmental racism, look into it. There's tons of things around that. So the one fact that I always try to convey to people is something that's relevant to them. So it totally depends where you're coming from. But when I was talking about, reducing waste on campus, I didn't just share, we need to reduce waste because it's good for turtles and it's good for the ocean. It's actually good for marginalized communities who are disproportionately located near landfills. And how can we do that? And so trying to find a fact that appeals to someone, and I'd encourage each person to kind of reflect on what that means to you and what that means to your circle of influence. There's also a brilliant, he's a photographer, Chris Jordan, out of the, I'll just post his website here. He creates art in terms of sustainability and looking at waste and all these different things. So the one fact that I always share is, can you look at this image and tell me what it looks like, and what does it represent? And what his pictures, it can be of there's one over here that looks, I think, at 6 million coffee cups, but you don't know what it is until you zoom out. And those are usually the type of facts I like to empower people with, because oftentimes it's not the fact you remember, it's how it made you feel. And so that feeling around a picture or a video, I think it's really effective.
So I think you did kind of touch upon this earlier with your last slide, but how do you deal with pushback on your ideas and thoughts? And why do you think there is so much pushback in general?
Sure. I feel like it's essential to have something set up for how to deal with that. I think the really important thing is having people who can support you. For me, like, not everyone's in this situation, but my partner doesn't work in sustainability, so but she gets it, and it's really nice to not have someone kind of talk about the same problems over and over in society, but that like is very kind of reassuring and supportive, like I am in her work as well. And I think there's pushback regardless, because sustainability is fundamentally about change to something better. And change scares people. There's a lot of research around organizational change. And I think trying to introduce yourself as someone who understands that change is scary for some people, there isn't just positives. You know what? Some people are going to perceive it as negative. Someone told me a couple of years ago, if I told everyone in this building that they could get $1,000 today, there would be two people that would be upset. One would be upset that they didn't get it yesterday, and one would be upset that they were on vacation and what happened. There's always extenuating circumstances where someone is going to be adversely impacted, but sustainability is trying to see balances in where we can and try and move to a more equitable way. I think everyone deals with resistance. I think acknowledging that it's a people problem, if you purely deal at it with a technical problem, it just won't work. And using those spheres of influence. So I ran into a problem where the decision maker that I wanted wasn't giving me an answer that I thought was acceptable. And so, you know what, maybe it's there, and obviously you want to go with them as much as possible, but then there's a sphere of influence. Like you have colleagues, you have different people who work with them. Hey, like, why is this person giving me this answer? I'm a bit confused. Can you explain the problem as well? And then eventually this decision maker changed their mind. So I think it's really helpful to examine, like, what is your sphere of influence? Can it be a bit more organic? As soon as you develop a personal connection with someone, a lot of these barriers decrease. So when I first started Humber, I spent a lot of time just trying to meet people in organic ways rather than setting up meetings. So I worked out at the gym. I would go to the cafeteria. I would try and meet people and just make connections. And that's been really, really helpful.
Oh, I love that idea of organic connections because, I don't know, it just really kind of clicked for me in a way to kind of bring people in your ideas, but it's not such a forceful and directed movement.